Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you very much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Hey, good.
Good to see you. We're going to do one of our quick bites. I don't remember the last time I did quick bites, but this is I think our 25th iteration of quick bites. So quick bites is when we take listener questions and you do your best to answer them around 5 minutes each. So these are also often great questions that perhaps don't warrant a full episode, but again, great questions nonetheless. So we've got 5 this time around. We've got questions about, should we take iron supplements if we're struggling with low levels, and how can diet help that? Can eating prunes actually preserve bone density? What's the best way to test body fat, and is it even worth doing it? Are plant proteins really less effective than animal proteins? And what does the science say about that? And then, is the hype around C15 fatty acids justified? And also, I'm going to add a question: what the heck are C15 fatty acids? So
we'll cover that. We will cover that.
To that. So real quick before we jump in, what's the best way, if folks do have questions, to get a question to you into a future Quick Bites episode?
Yeah. OptimizeMeNutrition.com/email is how you get on my email list. And if you click reply to any email I send out, I have a really intricate sorting process that hopefully gets you in the queue in the right order.
Awesome. And we will say, a lot of times we build complete episodes around questions. And so even if your specific question doesn't get into a Quick Bites, a lot of times EC will, again, it's in the system. So
it's in the system.
Okay. First question we've got is from Nikki. She says, I understand that supplementation isn't effective in most cases, but what about iron? I'd run into trouble with my iron levels getting so low I lost a heap of hair. It's 2.5 years later and I'm still trying to get it back. In my case, I believe it's a combination of heavy periods, huge training volume, and a calorie deficit diet. Is there a way to avoid iron supplements in this case? Also, I have heard that when iron levels are low, it is almost impossible to lose weight. Is this true? So a couple of questions inside of there.
Yeah, and I really like Nikki's question because this is exactly a scenario where supplementation actually makes sense. For all the times that I've said, no, oh my gosh, we now actually have an example of where you should supplement. And why Nikki's case is different is because A, she's been tested to have low levels specifically of the supplement that she plans on taking. And even more so, B, she has this clinical presentation that matches the low levels that were measured, right? She has the outcome of what we think should happen when somebody has low iron, the loss of the hair, the heavy periods, which is where you lose a lot of iron, right? And a low calorie diet makes it harder to meet all of your nutrient needs just because you have less foods in the diet, right? So much of what I speak out against with supplementation is that I have people that are otherwise healthy individuals, or if anything, they might just be a little bit tired as we are in modern busy life. But they don't have any real diagnosis. They don't have any real symptoms, and they're just sort of supplementing with whatever TikTok is showing them that day, right, for optimal wellness and all of that stuff. It's just, ugh. But conversely, when we have a very specific and targeted reason to do so, it totally makes sense, and it's a great use of supplementation. And so now to her other questions, though, is there a way to avoid iron supplementation? Well, the first way is to fix the diet. You know, she mentions that she's been on the supplementation for 2.5 years, and she also mentions that she has this caloric deficit diet. I'm not sure why she would be in a caloric deficit for that long. Now, I do understand that if you have a really high training volume, that sometimes our athletes are under-fueled just because they don't have time in the day to get through all the calories they need. But she really wants to think about it as fueling enough is going to help performance. And so that sounds like a big interest and goal of hers, that we really should not be trying to trend on a caloric deficit diet, especially for that long and especially with that type of training volume. So I would really recommend that she looks to be eating enough calorically speaking. And then once we're there, we're going to start trying to increase our consumption of more iron-rich foods, which would be the meat, the seafood, the beans, the lentils, that type of stuff. But you know, for her to be able to come off supplementation, she is still going to have to get tested at least for some time. If the diet changes, you can think about going off the supplement once you are kind of within normal levels, but you're still going to want to retest once you go off the supplement just to make sure that your diet really is making up the difference there. And maybe you would retest every 6 months or so to make sure that the diet is adequate enough. But, you know, depending on how heavy her periods are, even her dietary preferences, this might be something that she has to take in the long term forever. Again, this is a case where I'm thinking like, gosh, this is obvious place for supplementation. Again, besides the fact that I would love for her to get her calories up. Okay. To the last question she heard that when iron levels are low, it's almost impossible to lose weight. Is that true? No, it's not true. Calories are what drive weight loss. But, this is where things get really interesting because we do have a lot of interrelationships between these different factors because iron can affect things like fatigue. Does the person who have low iron just not have the energy to work out and stick to their diet? Is that what's really driving the lack of weight loss? And so this is how it can become all kind of interrelated. All at the end of the day, it would still come down to whether or not the person has reduced their calories relative to what they need for weight loss.
Next question is from Katie. She sent over, this study came up on my Substack. Prunes preserve hip bone mineral density in a 12-month randomized controlled trial in post-menopausal women, the Prune study. It seems too good to be true, but understanding research isn't my expertise. You've mentioned in your podcast both randomized controlled studies and repeatability for study merit and usefulness. I didn't know if this qualified or if you could debunk this readily.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting study. So again, the postmenopausal women were randomized into one of three groups. The control group, which got nothing, or they might have gotten some other dried fruit. I'd have to go back and check. The second group got 50 grams of prunes a day. And the third group got 100 grams of prunes a day. Now, just for reference, 50 grams of prunes is about 6, and 100 grams of prunes then would be about 12. And what they did is they had these prunes added to their other regular diet for a year. So this is cool. We're looking at long term. And then, yes, they measured their bone mineral density. This is the D'Souza paper in the show notes. And so bone mineral density is a major issue for postmenopausal women. We're really concerned about osteoporosis. We believe the decline of estrogen is involved in osteoporosis. So is diet and exercise. But the reason why it's involved is you want to think about bone is a lot like muscle in that it's going through these constant processes of being broken down and rebuilding. And estrogen plays a crucial role in maintaining bone density. It inhibits bone resorption, which is the breakdown, and it promotes bone formation. So obviously with declining estrogen, that is typically tipped in the balance of the bone resorption or breakdown. And it's thought to be that the prunes can better balance this breakdown and rebuilding because of their phenolic content. Now, when I say phenolic content, these are examples of phytochemicals, the different thousands of plant chemicals that we've talked about a bunch actually recently. Thousands of them. We don't really know what they're all doing. They have these different bioactive properties, and we believe that maybe the phenolic content in the prunes is what's helping them kind of keep a better balance of bone formation versus breakdown. Now, basically the findings were that the 50 grams of prunes consumption a day prevented bone mass density loss at the hip. Now, so did 100 grams, but if 50 grams is going to do it, then we're not going to worry about taking 100 grams, right? Now let's get into the nitty gritty. The important thing to point out about bone mineral density or bone density is it's measured at different points. So they can measure total bone density, like across all of the bones, but they also will look at spine bone density. They'll also look at hip bone density. They'll also look at femur bones. And it's the spine and the hip that they use specifically to calculate the degree of osteoporosis. It's important to point out in this study, the prunes did not improve bone mineral density for the total measurement, the spine, or the femur. What it did do is at the hip, it prevented loss. So the control group lost about 1% of their bone density in the year at the hip, which is sort of what we expect of women in this age range. The prune group, the 50-gram prune group, maintained their bone density at the hip. So it is pretty cool that the prunes did that. But it does make you ask, is there something that doesn't just prevent loss, but actually adds or improves bone density? And guess what? Looks like we're back to exercise. And so, maybe even a more comprehensive diet that has more phenolic compounds besides just adding 6 prunes a day, but something that has lots of fruits and veggies, something that maybe has a good amount of calcium even, and then enough weight-bearing exercise. Maybe we would actually have people who improve their bone density and not just prevent loss at one specific point in the body. What would the people who do all of that, what would their bone density be in comparison? And so this is where we come back to this idea that the basics, especially in combination with each other, diet, exercise, sleep, are going to outperform any of these individual hacks that we come up with, like the 6 prunes. Again, I think it's pretty cool that 6 prunes could do that at the hip. But I think when we see studies like this is we forget all of the things that were not tested. We forget that, okay, well, how would this compare to somebody doing resistance training twice a week and aerobic exercise, weight bearing 3 times a week, and eating an 800-gram challenge and getting enough calcium in their diet and that type of stuff. And I have a feeling that that person I just described doing a combination of basics is going to be better off than the person who added 6 prunes to their diet.
We've talked about this before, but as part of the challenge of what you just laid out, which is like, a couple of days of strength training, couple of days of conditioning, 800-gram challenge, etc. The challenge of that is a lot easier to measure. Did you eat your 6 prunes today? And do that over the course of a year. And now we've got enough data that is clean, quote unquote clean, that we can say, okay, this did that and the control group did something else, right?
Yeah, they would have to do it where like one group got all of the mixture of the things, one group got 3 of the things, like the sleep, the exercise, and the fruits and veggies, and one group got 2 of the thing. They'd have to kind of stair step it. But then also think about that by running the study to keep people doing diet and lifestyle changes for a year. I mean, it's freaking hard. Yep. And so I appreciate the intent. Like if we can get 6 prunes to do the same thing, great. But hey, what we found is that it prevents bone loss at one part of the overall skeleton, not necessarily better than exercise. This is not something that I'm like, oh wow, this is so powerful. But you are right. This study is way more easy to run and ideally would be a better solution if it could compete with the basics all done in combination.
Got it. All right. Third question we've got is from Lindsay. She sent over, what is the best for body fat testing? DEXA scan versus calipers versus in-body scan. With DEXA, they offer calculating your BMR for $100. Is it worth the money?
Yeah, this is one question that I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, it's going to be hard for me to do in 5 minutes. This is one I can go in so many theoretical what ifs and then the technicalities of it and all this stuff. But the short of all of that, or I'm going to try to make it the short of all of that, is why do you want an accurate body fat test? What is that number really going to do for you? I recently had a social media post about body fat testing, and somebody commented, which I thought was probably the best answer and use of a truly accurate body fat test. And they were mentioning that an accurate body fat test is probably most useful for somebody who's doing a bodybuilding show and they want to see where they are relative to their progress for getting on stage for which they're about to be evaluated for that level of body fatness, right? And I was like, yeah, that's actually a really good use of the body fat test. That's typically not our audience, at least as far as we understand, right? Our audience is typically those who are interested. Yes, they have weight goals, but they also have general health goals, and they also are interested in improving performance. From a health perspective, there is a range of body fats where you can be healthy. It's about 12 to 20% for men and about 20 to 30% for women. You'll know if you fall in those ranges simply by Googling body fat percentages, looking at the pictures, and then looking at yourself in the mirror. You're going to be able to figure out whether or not you are in those ranges. So in terms of figuring out, okay, is my body fat percentage healthy? We just went over how you can do that. Beyond that, if you're like, well, okay, I'm healthy enough, but for aesthetic reasons, I might want to be leaner, I can assure you there is no percentage that you will hear from InBody, from a caliper measurement, from DEXA, that is going to change your opinion about what you see in the mirror. You could come back from DEXA and they could tell you 16%. If you don't like what you see in the mirror, if you think you should be more lean, that doesn't mean anything, right? And then in terms of performance goals, there is no percentage that you will hear from InBody, from a caliper measurement, from DEXA that will guarantee you a better deadlift, a better 5K time, on and go, right? So the point is we can spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out the most accurate way to assess body fat when we should ask ourselves, what is this number going to do for me? I can use the mirror to confirm I'm in a healthy range. I can use the mirror to confirm aesthetic reasons, and I can use my performance metrics for performance. What else do I need to know, Now, the other thing to keep in mind, why I push back a lot on this for people, is they are all estimates. No matter the method, there is error associated with them. Like DEXA is considered the gold standard, but that, as well as in-body scans, are very much affected by hydration status because a lot of water is stored in your muscle. So when you are hydrated, you're going to appear leaner on these tests. And lots of things affect hydration status. Of course, eating and drinking, how close relative to the test, but also how close to the test did you work out? What's the temperature and the altitude? So this is a big reason why whatever scan you go to, it's not necessarily that accurate. And you could see a difference between 2-point measurements, but it's more a reflection of your hydration change than necessarily a fat mass change. And so I care less about which one you use and more that you try to quiet the noise around the conditions to going to get tested and instead then getting repeated measurements of the same test. Like if you're going to pick DEXA, then you want to stick with DEXA. You want to go to the same place, the same machine. And you also want to think about it as I'm going to go the same time of day, after I've used the restroom, before breakfast, after a rest day. Like that type of quieting the noise such that we try to now really start to look at fat mass changes. But even then, you're going to look at like, how does it change over 6-month periods over the course of multiple years, not necessarily take any 2 points and think that you've distinctly changed 2% of body fat. Because again, there's estimates. There's going to be error in all of this. So we want to look at long-term trends, not any single 2 points. With all of that being said, this is where I just don't see a ton of utility in them. If I was really stoked on doing it, I'd probably choose InBody just for convenience and then work on kind of minimizing the noise as I just mentioned. But I think for a lot of people, mirror, tape measure around the waist or a fitted pair of pants, and then pick a performance metric is deadlift, 5K run time, number of pull-ups, I don't care what it is. That's going to give you the information that you want, you know? Mm-hmm. The last thing that I want to touch on was her question about DEXA and the BMR calculation. So BMR is basal metabolic rate, and it's the portion of calories you burn in a day to stay alive. It's the portion of calories that we burn to do basic things like have a heartbeat, to be able to breathe, to have your blood pressure, all of that stuff. And it's only one of the 4 different components that we have to calculate our total calories burned. So in addition to the calories that we need for these basic physiological functions, we also have something called thermic effect of food, which is the calories that we burn to digest and absorb food. We also have NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the calories that we burn to walk, go up and down the stairs, to get in and out of your car, just some basic movement in the day. And then we also have the calories in EAT, or exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the calories that you burn when you're actually at the gym or you're at your CrossFit workout or something like that. And so the number of calories you burn any single day requires you to know all of those 4 components. It wouldn't just require you to know BMR, which is a portion of that. And so that's why I don't really see that a ton of utility in BMR, because it's not actually the answer you want. You want to know the total calories that you burn in a single day. And to keep this answer from being 35 minutes, I'm going to reference a podcast we did on how to calculate that. It's something like figuring out how much to eat, and we'll put the link in the show notes so you can actually get that number instead of what DEXA would estimate.
Okay, I've got one question, but at risk of sending you down the rabbit hole, you're trying really hard not to go down.
I know.
So apologies if we do.
Let's do it.
My question is, I can already think of like 3 or 4 gyms, CrossFit gyms, that have the InBody, and obviously calipers were there before that, and I don't really know what DEXA scan is, but I can guess at it. I bring all that up to say, or to ask, what is the argument that a gym, and of course the InBody, the company that makes InBody, what is the argument that they're making for its utility, such that a gym would say, yeah, we want to buy one of those and put them in the office so that we can have our members come in here and measure on some frequency, whether it's every month, every 3 months, every year, whatever it might be. What is the argument for something like that? And why aren't gyms saying, don't worry about that. Worry about what you just did in Fran versus what you did at Fran last year, and what your deadlift PR is versus what it was. Why the need for the number, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, we'd like data. We'd like to see progress. It's almost like apps. And, with my own app now, obviously I like them to some degree, but the data can sometimes help drive the behavior change.
Got it.
And so it's less about the fact that the thing actually says you're 16% body fat, and more that the person is now committed to a month so that they see that they're 16% body fat. That's the real value in them. And there is value there. The problem is I also see the downside of it. And so like everything, we just have to know the limitations of the tools. That some people will stick to their freaking 800-gram challenge for a month. They'll go 4 days a week. And then their body fat percentage when they get measured at the end of the month might be up 2%. And they might think they've actually gained fat. And they haven't, right? So it's just sort of like this is where it gets a little bit problematic, that these small little changes people will often interpret as a failure of the diet and not realizing that they're just at the limits of the accuracy of the test.
Got it.
And this is where the utility then becomes in kind of the long-term play and really looking at trends versus saying, oh gosh, in a month I changed 2% fat. It's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Okay, super helpful. Next question we've got is from James. This is what he sent over. I always thought that one of the differences for selecting animal versus plant-based protein was due to the lower bioavailability of plant protein, or the amount your body can actually absorb. Say, even if you consume 20 grams of plant protein, your body can only absorb 40 to 50% of it, whereas animal protein is closer to 100%. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a follow-up to an email that I sent out, and it's a good question. It's something that I believed as well for some time, but it just doesn't seem to be true. And that for my plant-based clients and animal-based clients alike, I still recommend the 0.7 grams per pound. But yeah, the idea here about the lower bioavailability for plant-based protein is that plant foods tend to have more fiber. And so fiber tends to make foods harder to break down. And so the idea is, okay, well, maybe we're not going to get all of the amino acids out of them because they're kind of entrained in this food matrix with all of this fiber. But one of the things that's important to understand is that whole animal-based foods don't have 100% digestion either. So the digestibility of eggs is in the low 90s%, and that's the same as what it is for like soy and pea protein isolate. And so this is from the Mariotti paper in the show notes. You can check that out. But this digestibility percent is really, hey, what's digest and absorb versus what ends up in the toilet bowl? And it looks like there's pretty good comparison between our animal and plant-based foods. Because again, animal-based foods are also in a food matrix. They're not just like these perfectly diced out amino acids when we take them in the form of eggs or meat or whatever. So pretty comparable, and it's not like plant proteins are down at the 40% range and, meat's up in the 90% range. I think, though, this is a good reminder that, in my opinion, a lot of this stuff ultimately, though, is settled not by me telling you what the research says, but by you taking that number, putting it into practice, being consistent, and then determining what to do based on that behavior. And I know James knows that. He's asking this from the science bioavailability point of view, all this stuff, and I think that's great. But I think a lot of times we have these ideas, and this is just more for the broad answer, the broad conceptual, we have this ideas of like, well, EC said 0.7 or something like that, or 0.7 might be high for me, or 0.7 might be perfect for me. What does the research say? And instead, it's like, worry less about the accurate number or what the theory is about the bioavailability of protein. Take the foods that you're eating, put a number into practice, see the effect, and then make a decision based on that. Some people aren't going to need 0.7. Some people are going to need more than 0.7. I think 0.7 is a great number for the reasons that we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast. But at the end of the day, it's much more important that you put in a number, change based on your results, than necessarily wondering what the research says on a specific level.
Got it. Okay. Last question we've got is from Alex. I've been seeing a lot online about C15 fatty acids, and there are all the red flags for this new supplement. But I would love your quick take on what the actual science behind it, if there is any, and whether it's something we should bother being concerned about in our diets. So what the heck is C15 fatty acids?
What the heck? Yeah. Yeah. To get to that, we first have to review a little bit on fats. We've got three main types of fats: polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated. And then each of those three types of fats have subtypes within them, different fatty acids within those big broad categories. So like omega-3 and omega-6 fats are types of polyunsaturated fats, right? So when we look at the saturated fat umbrella, there's actually 40 different types of saturated fatty acids. Now, the most common are palmitic acid, lauric acid, myristic acid, and stearic acid. The C15 fatty acids, the pentadecanoic acid, is one of those 40 different types of saturated fatty acids. It's just not one of the most common ones. I already just listed those 4 common ones, right? Now, small amounts of these C15 fatty acids can be found in dairy fat and meat. So the first thing I want to point out about saturated fatty acids is they're generally considered the bad fat. Now, hopefully we've added some nuance to that over various podcast episodes. The reason why we generally think about saturated fat as a bad fat is because it has the potential to increase LDL cholesterol, quote, the bad cholesterol, which can increase your risk for heart disease. Now, I didn't say saturated fat causes heart disease. I said saturated fat may increase LDL cholesterol, which may increase your risk of heart disease, which is way different. And then your development of heart disease, of course, relies on a lot of other things like your genetics, the rest of your diet, exercise, all of that stuff. So we've got a couple podcasts that talk way more about cholesterol, but that's generally why we try to cut back on saturated fats, or we don't love saturated fat. Now, what's interesting is there's even some nuance within that. Like we'll just sort of say, okay, saturated fats tend to increase LDL cholesterol. Well, some of the controversy about that statement is we find that not all of those saturated fatty acids, again, remember there's 40, not all of them behave the same way. Of the four most common I mentioned, 3, palmitic, myristic, and lauric acid, tend to be the ones that raise LDL cholesterol, where stearic acid doesn't raise LDL cholesterol, it's neutral. So there are going to be these cases where not all of the saturated fatty acids are, quote, bad. And so when we get to this C15 fatty acid, admittedly, it's not very common. We don't have as much of it present as the other ones I've mentioned. What we find is it might be one of the ones that lowers cholesterol. So this is where nutrition gets really confusing, right? Because we've got saturated fatty acids. We generally consider them bad because they generally raise cholesterol. It turns out that's not true across all of them. Some of them raise, some of them are neutral, some of them might lower. I know, we just keep peeling back the onion layers, it seems. But anyway, what they've found is that there have been several studies that have linked higher circulating levels of this C15 fatty acid to lower risk of heart disease. The problem with this, of course, is these are association studies. So we don't know if the fatty acid is driving the lower risk or it just happens to be the byproduct of an otherwise healthy diet and on all these other reasons, right? So a lot more research needs to be done. There are a couple human clinical trials with these C15 fatty acids. One of the ones that I wanted to point out was they did a study looking at various biomarker changes using a Mediterranean diet with or without the C15 supplementation. So they gave people some good diet changes, but then they also said, hey, take these fatty acids or don't take these fatty acids and let's see what happened. Now, interestingly enough, the LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, dropped most significantly with the combination of the Mediterranean diet and the C15 supplementation.
Okay.
So yeah, we've got some early preliminary research that this could be doing something favorable. But guess what? Like, we're not going to take one study, with 30 people or whatever it was and be like, okay, this is all going to solve all of our problems. We need bigger studies. We need another group to repeat the results before this would be something that we would really recommend for people to use therapeutically. Because again, we already have some alternatives for people to use to help lower their cholesterol therapeutically. And again, this is what I think people forget about. Like, when a study looks at one or two things, you forget about all the other options that may exist, right? You might forget about the fact that we already have options to lower cholesterol therapeutically. So for my otherwise healthy individuals who are not looking at this from a therapeutic point of view, but are instead thinking about, okay, should I have more C15 fatty acids in my diet to be healthy? Well, again, it's going to be found in meat and dairy products. And I think these can be part of a healthy diet, no surprise. But the problem would be if you're consuming a lot of them, you're also consuming some of those other saturated fatty acids, the one that tend to increase LDL cholesterol. So no surprise, we're going to keep them in the right quantity within the context of the rest of the healthy diet. And I think you're going to be healthy, but I wouldn't try to seek out and be like, okay, I really want to increase my C15 intake. Because guess what? You're going to increase your palmitic, your myristic acid, which has the potential to increase your LDL cholesterol. That's what's so interesting about food, right? Like, you're not going to eat something and just get your C15. You have to eat the mixture of them. And when we look at what happens when people eat a lot of dairy, a lot of saturated fat, is they tend to increase their LDL cholesterol, even though some of the saturated fatty acids might not have that effect.
Got it. Thank you, C. One more reminder, optimizemenutrition.com/email. Get on the newsletter list.
Yeah.
Cool. So get on the newsletter list, folks. Hit reply to any of EC's emails. She'll get you into the system. Let us know what's on your mind. We do appreciate it. And again, I said this at the top, but sometimes we can get to the questions in a quick bite. Sometimes EC sees them and says, oh, I think that there's a whole episode here. So it is very helpful to reach out and let us know what is on your mind, what you're curious about. Helps us figure out what to continue talking about into the future. So thank you for that. Do make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening or watching this so you don't miss another episode. And EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.